Hey, you ever notice there's a lot of talk about when a long-running cartoon has died, quote-unquote? Because I know I have. Oh god, I have. And if you haven't, well then, I've got one question to ask. How? Please, tell me how. It's a topic I'm basically forced to listen to every goddamn day, whether I want to hear it or not. And trust me, I don't. So many tweets, so many video essays, so many casual conversations, day after day after day, non-stop. It's just, hey man, this show right here, it fell off right there, man. That was the point where this series died, bro. It was slaughtered, it was killed, it was butchered, and then it was never the same again. Never, ever, never. It's so exhausting to me whenever it comes up, and the main reason for why is that, in my opinion, keeping it real, I don't think death is the right word to describe most of the shows these people are talking about. I mean, when you hear discussions on if or when a cartoon died, what are the main contenders? Simpsons, Family Guy, and South Park, those are the big three, and the way I see it, none of these shows have truly died. You wanna know why? Because for a series to die, it's gotta mess up big and it's gotta mess up quick, same as how it works in the real world. Think about it. The act of dying is something that eclipses every other moment in a person's life, leaving their body an empty, soulless husk in the blink of an eye. It's the ultimate final moment of something's being ceasing to exist. So for a show to do the same metaphorically, again, if you're asking me, it's gotta make a decision so bad and so sudden with such intensity that once it happens, it'll destroy any goodwill you have for the work moving forward. It's gotta be an honest-to-God reputation killer, and when it comes to shows like the big three, they just haven't gotten to that point. They could be on the way there, slowly making worse and worse decisions that might lead to death eventually, but they're not actually dead. They're just not quite what they used to be. It happens. No great thing that goes on for long enough is gonna stay at its peak forever. Inevitably, sooner or later, whether it's due to a change in staff, or studios, or priorities, or all of them, there's gonna be a drop in quality that gets more and more pronounced as the years go. But that doesn't mean it died, it means it's old. Like, yeah, it makes for a good title to say, this is when The Simpsons died, but was Principal and the Pauper really that bad? Can you seriously say that that one episode was so violently terrible The Simpsons could never be seen as the same show again? I don't think so. In my eyes, it and most of these other shows have never done anything to forsake the audience and burn down what they'd built. They just gradually lost steam due to a variety of factors over a long period and eventually became comfortably mid. Oh, but hold on. Did I say big three? Sorry about that, I should have said big four. After all, it may technically be targeted at slightly younger viewers than my other examples, but SpongeBob SquarePants is still a long-running show that's iconically beloved and, until very recently, from my perspective, was more or less in the same boat of not being dead, despite how other people have claimed it is. Although, to be fair, comparatively speaking, I will admit I understand Sponge Doomers more than anyone else, seeing as SpongeBob, admittedly, has had way more noticeable drops in quality than any other big cartoon I can think of. For the first 3 seasons in a movie, everyone knows those are the best. There's no topping the absolute consistency and quality of that era. The gags, the stories, the animation, the characters, all of it was so perfectly in sync to create something generation-definingly great that people still quote and reference it to this day, even if they haven't seen it. It's that ubiquitous with pop culture. Early SpongeBob was a milestone in entertainment and comedy. It set a new standard for series that were so smartly written and subtly complex that they could be loved by adults just as much as kids for how clever they were. So it's only natural that once creator Steven Hillenburg, who wrote on almost every single episode and oversaw the series, left as the show went into its 4th season, people got upset. It was a big change felt in the writing that only got more noticeable over time, showing signs that without Steve there to lead the way, the remaining cast weren't quite sure what the series moving forward should be. They knew the basic cast, setting, premise, and humor, pretty much everyone on the planet did, and not every episode was solely his doing, but Steve was the vessel pointing where the ship would lead. He knew where to take these characters and what stories worked best to draw out their most hilarious, memorable traits. So without that guidance and sharp vision, it just wasn't the same. He may have been formally replaced as showrunner by his close friend Paul Tibbitt, who'd worked on SpongeBob alongside him, but that didn't stop the team from lacking focus in Steve's absence. So with no idea how to keep going at the same pace or be the same show, they just did whatever to see what stuck. One episode, SpongeBob could get fused with Squidward into an eldritch horror abomination, the next he could have a wig, and that's it. That was the whole plot of an episode in season 4. They really were throwing random concepts at the wall, hoping something would land. And occasionally, to give the team a little credit, every once in a while, it kinda did. There were a few good times they firmly stuck the landing by striking the right chord between bringing new ideas and keeping the old charm. But most of the time, they did not at all. The lack of direction was highly palpable, and as they kept struggling for years trying to find a new style but never committing, the overall consistency just kept dropping. The newer films couldn't hold a candle to the first. Their attempts at spin-offs were hit or miss. The series itself briefly bounced back thanks to Hillenburg returning, but somehow reached even lower after his unfortunate death. Devolving from doing anything they could think of to being so reliant on old material, it started basing full episodes off one-off gags and characters. Basically, in short, the property's been having sudden drops for about as long as I've been alive, and as a reminder here, I'm 20, so I can't exactly say it's unjustified for fans to be upset. Hell, I stopped watching the show regularly around the start of season 12 6 years ago, but going back to my original point, in spite of that and all the wrong turns it's taken over and over again, I never got the impression that SpongeBob had a moment where you could go, yep, this is it is so over. At worst, it could get bad. Really bad. But it takes worse than that to be a reputation killer, so with that in mind, I always held out the vaguest optimism, hoping the property could maybe stabilize and live out its days never truly dying, until Saving Bikini Bottom, the Sandy Cheeks movie released, officially, and I gave up. They finally did it. They broke me. This movie? This film right here? This is my Pearl Harbor. This is my rock bottom. This is... You wanna know how much this fucking movie's affected me? Cause it's been way more of a factor in my life for the last week or so than I ever anticipated. Silly me, I thought this video was gonna be a short little rant in between my regular content about some dumb movie that sucks. That was my original plan, assuming I could find material in it at all, but then I watched it, and needless to say, it ended up being so much worse than even I could have expected. It got me to go through and rewatch every piece of SpongeBob media I could think of just to help me figure out why. Why, out of all SpongeBob-related things, was it this stupid, shitty, formerly Pirate Bay exclusive movie that made me give up and say full stop, SpongeBob, as a brand, is dead? That's a question I've been asking myself every day for a while now, but I think I've finally cracked it. I've gone through all the movies, I've looked back at the show, I've jogged my memory as best I can within the restrictive constraints of the YouTube algorithm, and so now I'm gonna present my findings and you're gonna fucking listen. This is why the Sandy Cheeks movie is the death of SpongeBob. No hyperbole. If you want to witness a murder without going on Live Leak, this is the place to be. And there's no better point to start from than something every dead property has in common. Part 1. It's the definition of flanderization. But wait, what does that word actually mean, flanderization? Chances are, if you've ever read IP death complaints, it's one of the first words you tend to see, but ironically, with how widely used it's become since it was coined, the specifics have gotten a little less clear. So, in case you're unaware, flanderization is what happens when a character who used to be well-rounded and three-dimensional slowly loses their subtleties while their recognizable traits are exaggerated until they pretty much turn into caricatures. It's an idea that's name comes from the Simpsons character Ned Flanders, who went from being a generally well-meaning, nice guy whose laid-back attitude and traditional Christian values countered the Simpsons' wackiness into essentially becoming Jesus Christ himself. He got super over-the-top preachy, squeaky clean to the point of parody, lost anything you could perceive as flaws, and you couldn't get him angry if your life depended on it. That's what flanderization is, removing nuance from a character either to make him easier to write or just from plain not understanding who they are. And SpongeBob is a show that's had that problem from the moment Steve left. It's never not been a problem, but the issue has clearly reached critical meltdown here. I don't think I've ever seen more bastardized versions of these characters. The whole plot of the film is about Bikini Bottom getting scooped up with only Sandy and SpongeBob left to save it, so I can't speak too much on how bad the rest of the cast is, seeing as they didn't have enough time to leave an impression, but these two are more than enough to get my point across. They are so bad. And it really hurts, because SpongeBob, and especially Sandy, used to be not just good foils to one another, but great individual personalities in their own rights. On one hand, SpongeBob was a guy who was naive and childish for someone implied to be an adult, having this optimistic vibe that permeated every choice he made, but what made it charming was that he wasn't delusional or annoying, he was just content with life. SpongeBob could still get angry, smug, jealous, or frustrated depending on the situation, but when he could, he tried his best to live with this appreciative curiosity and love for everything around him. He loved his friends, he loved his job, he loved his asshole neighbor who, by contrast, was disillusioned with the world and thought he inherently deserved better than what he had. That's why he was so likable to people of all ages. He was by all means a kid at heart, but he wasn't a child, and Sandy was just as deep. In fact, I'd go as far as saying that Sandy, during the early seasons, is one of the most complex characters on the show purely for how adaptable she is from story to story. You know, the whole thing in her introduction is being a chill, thrill-seeking tomboy foreigner unaware of how sea creatures work, being a squirrel and all, but as the show goes on, we see she's actually one of the smartest people around who usually serves as the voice of reason when SpongeBob does something dumb. However, she isn't always that either, since she's also fiercely competitive and can get caught up in things just as easily as SpongeBob. That's why they were great foils. They never had a set dynamic. Sometimes SpongeBob got carried away, sometimes Sandy got carried away, one could be the aggressor in a conflict, or both could feed into it. You couldn't categorize their relationship in the same way as Patrick and SpongeBob or Squidward and SpongeBob, where it was more set in stone what kind of dynamic they would have. There was a chemistry between them that wasn't present with anyone else in the cast. It's probably why after the pilot episode centered around SpongeBob and his job, she's the first new character we get to meet. They just inherently mix really well together, so if we still had the early versions of these characters, I would have said putting them together for a movie almost makes more sense than SpongeBob and Patrick. Like, don't get me wrong, they made it work best for the first movie, which, by the way, is still an unrepentant fucking banger 20 years on, in case you were wondering, but theoretically, from the perspective of a long-ass film that's built off two specific characters we follow along, Sandy and SpongeBob just bounce off each other way better when there's no one else around. With Patrick, he's great at making situations worse and being the outright dumb fun half to SpongeBob's naivete, but he works best when him and SpongeBob are reacting to things together. Well, with Sandy, she and SpongeBob could spend a whole film just hanging out, and it would be great. No, I don't see the irony in that statement, considering the film I'm supposed to be talking about is basically that and sucks, because like I said, these are not SpongeBob and Sandy. These are their bastard stepchildren, Dumb Bob and Blandy, or should I say, Flandy. Risation. Got 'em. But no, okay, seriously, what is it this film does that makes me think they've been Flanderized so heavily? Well, to be honest, if I'm gonna play semantics here, which if this video's premise is any indication, I definitely am, it's actually not quite as much the film itself that made them Flanderized, but rather, what it does is just exacerbate problems that started back in season 4 and makes them about 10 times worse. Now, both characters have equally gone through the shit, so it's hard to say which is objectively more terrible than the other here, but Sandy's shift is so drastic it literally shapes the entire plot of the film, so let's start off small with what happened to SpongeBob. Remember back a couple seconds ago when I said his charm came from not being annoying or delusional, but genuinely happy with the life he has? Go ahead and erase that from your brain. Starting in season 4, SpongeBob's mannerisms started leaning further and further into full-blown dumb kid territory over being a childish but functioning adult who was just naive. And I thought it hit the ceiling when he got so brain-dead he couldn't recognize his pet was being eaten, but the Sandy Cheeks movie burst through that ceiling and revealed that the sky's the limit on how clinically brain-dead SpongeBob can be. Shit, in the opening minutes of this film, SpongeBob is legit confirmed to have an IQ of 0.5. They're not being fucking subtle about this. They know that SpongeBob's devolved into being a shell of his former self, and instead of course correcting to make him whole again, they've played into it. So now, SpongeBob isn't just a moron, he's such a moron that I'm fairly certain he has no bearing on the world around him. Like, I know this sounds blasphemous, but to give season 7 SpongeBob some credit, he was at least able to recognize that he was in danger when that thing trying to eat his snails started eating him. He knew when he was in peril, but this guy, he's so fucking inept that, okay, to give a little exposition here, Bikini Bottom got stolen so this scientist working at Sandy's old lab could clone the cast and turn them into marketable pet sea creatures that breathe on land. It's dumb as hell and I'll get to it later, but one thing that's made abundantly clear about the process is that once they're cloned, the original will cease to exist and become a legion. So essentially, the original consciousness will die and its clone will be sold off to stupid kids to be their playthings. Pretty intense shit. Not not a good situation. But do you want to know what SpongeBob does when he's told this is gonna happen and gets put into a little roller coaster for some reason that has no restraints and leads to the cloning device? That's right, he does nothing. Nothing at all. Nothing at all. Nothing at all. No, actually, my mistake. That's wrong. He doesn't do nothing. He fucking cheers. He cheers as he's carted along to his death in a slow contraption he could easily get out of at any time and actively chooses not to. It's not like he didn't hear that crucial information. It's very distinctly audible to everyone in the room the Wanda Sykes villain says it, so he knows. He just doesn't care. And that's what happens in every goddamn scene of this film. He's supposed to be the sort of sidekick character to Sandy here, acting as this film's resident Patrick, but he provides so little to anything by virtue of not being in touch with reality. I'd say he's less a character and more equipped dispensing sentient rocks Sandy's forced to drag around. He is genuinely worse than useless, so I guess on that front you could say Sandy's better, but she sucks in this for reasons so different than SpongeBob, it's kinda hard to compare. See, Sandy's interesting when it comes to the idea of flanderized characters, in that unlike most who follow that definition I gave to the letter, she, how do I say this? She did the inverse of that, where over the writers accentuating her actual prominent traits, they decided she had to be defined by the fact that she is a scientist and from Texas. Two things that, in the first 3 seasons of SpongeBob, were background information at most. I mean, Sandy is a proud Texan. From her introduction, she has a very thick southern accent, and there's a whole episode dedicated to her missing her home, but it was never a defining part of who she was as a person. It was mostly used for gags and explaining why she knows how to use a lasso or whatever, and had almost no bearing on who she was as a person. And being a scientist, that was hardly even really a thing. There is an episode in season 1 where she builds a rocket ship to go to the moon and mentions how it's science, but aside from that, she doesn't do anything science related. I guess it is vaguely implied she's a scientist of some sort. How else could she make a tree dome on the ocean floor and live there? But it was so insignificant, she's never so much as labeled a scientist once in the first 3 seasons. I checked. It was barely a thing, and for sure, it was never an episode plot. All of Sandy's appearances in the Golden Age have to do with her either dealing with or creating issues unknowingly through her being a land creature in the sea, being muscular or cool and SpongeBob trying to be the same, doing extreme things as SpongeBob tags along, or being the responsible one who talks SpongeBob down from whatever new idea he or Patrick has taken as fact. There were never any episodes centered around the idea of her being a scientist, except maybe the rocket one, and that's highly debatable. My point is, her being a scientist didn't matter for a long time. It was so minuscule, I didn't feel the need to bring it up when I was discussing the Golden Age. But then season 4 came around, and inexplicably, science became her main defining attribute. Every episode was about her making an invention that went wrong, or doing something science-related, and if they weren't about that, they were either about how she was from Texas or liked karate. Yeah, they sanded down her tomboyish, thrill-seeking nature into purely how she likes karate. Hey, at least it's relevant. Better than getting rid of every existing trait to define her around things that had no bearing on who she was before. But can you guess what they decided to not keep in for the movie? I'm losing my shit! And it gets worse! Because the whole movie is about how the lab that takes Bikini Bottom is her old lab, and they supposedly quote-unquote used her scientific research, whatever that means, to do it, so it's like doubly important to the plot. And you may also be wondering, wait, you can't use science in Texas as the basis for someone's entire character? How do they get away with that? But funny thing there, they really don't. It doesn't contribute anything to who she is as a person, obviously, so the best the writing team could do was give her a song in the opening about how she loves science in a very ambiguous way, and then later on, to give her anything that might be considered interesting, we find out that she used to perform in a circus with her very Texan family before going to Bikini Bottom. Again though, that information isn't something that defines any aspect of her personality. It doesn't give us any greater insight into the character of Sandy Cheeks, it's merely a new thing that is now true about her. So, in other words, she she doesn't have a personality in this film. Not that that's a new observation, the crew took that away long ago, it's just that here, by making her the protagonist and amplifying those two non-traits to be as big as possible, they made it so everyone would notice except for them. How could you be this flagrantly unself-aware? It boggles the mind. And I don't want to hear from any straight offender saying, oh, but what about that scene where she beats up the snakes in the Karate Island outfit? What about that? Listen, first of all, her fighting something with karate once doesn't make up for the lack of personality she has. It doesn't make up for how her relationship with Spongebob has gone from deep and multifaceted to the equivalent of a mother dragging her annoying child around on a leash as they spit out random phrases. At best, it's a nod to something she used to be, but I don't know why you would make a nod to an already flanderized personality trait. Now, I'm gonna point out this moment for what it really is. A reference. That's it. It's a reference to an episode so you can remember when she wore the Kill Bill suit. Why else would she cross-dissolve into having on that specific outfit? There's no deeper meaning, and while it as well as the other pointlessly added references in this film are annoying enough, I swear they do the fucking My Leg guy 4 different times, those moments don't hold a candle to when that too, it's shockingly unoriginal. And it's terrible at stealing. Although I should clarify that when I say that, I'm not just talking about how it's another characters travel in a pair of two to save the people they love story, same as the first and third film that came before it. That definitely doesn't help this movie's case on the originality front, and it would be the easier thing to rant about if I were a lesser sponge historian than I am, but what I'm specifically referring to with this section is how what's supposed to be the core message of this movie, that being how, while Sandy is from Texas, and misses everything she left behind, she comes to realize she sees the residents of Bikini Bottom like a second family, is not only terribly conveyed and barely present at all as a theme, but it's also not a unique thing that's been done with Sandy's character. Ladies and gentlemen of the court, if I could have your attention please, allow me to direct you to evidence number 01/18A, otherwise known as the 36th episode of the first season, Texas. An episode that, though it's mostly known for being where the Sandy lassos Patrick and he explodes in the distance and no I'm Texas bits come from, it's a really good episode comedy-wise, also has a moral that while Sandy is from Texas and misses everything she's left behind, she comes to realize that home is where you got people that care about you, and the residents of Bikini Bottom care about Sandy. Huh. Now, I'm no philosophy major, I'm just an early high school graduate from Delaware who never went to college and likes putting on a southern accent, but, and tell me if I'm wrong, ladies and gentlemen, but is it me, or did this hour and 20-minute film from 2024 steal a message and arc for Sandy that was already done at the start of the series almost 25 years ago? Cause look, I wouldn't wanna accuse anyone of anything here, but fuck it, nah, that's what they did. They even stole the idea of Sandy singing a country song about being a Texas girl by putting it at the start of the film. And this isn't a musical, there's just this one song plus a callback number at the end with a couple false starts in between. So yeah, guys, you didn't exactly do a good job covering your tracks here. Oh, but Braxton, maybe it's an homage. Maybe it's a callback to a classic episode that's been extended to add more weight and meaning than it did before. And you know, I might be willing to believe that. No, I wouldn't, but I might be slightly more open to the idea of believing that if they hadn't found a way to do the message worse in the film. Seriously, they took a moral that worked great on its own in an 11-minute setting and did it worse in an hour and 20 minutes by not understanding what was needed to make it better. And it's weird, since the original episode is already built on such a simple concept that could have been expanded. The way it goes is that Sandy feels homesick for Texas and sings a song about her heartache. SpongeBob decides they need to do something before she goes back home forever. He surprises her with a party where everyone in Bikini Bottom tries to recreate Texas in their own oblivious ways, and Sandy sees that she was home from the beginning. It's nice, it's easy, it's well-paced, but if I'm being totally upfront, with more time, it could be improved. Like, for instance, the Bikini Bottomites do a good gesture joining in with SpongeBob to put this all together, showing they care, but if the episode had a longer runtime to establish why everyone cares enough about Sandy to do this, seeing as we hadn't seen her interact too much with the rest of the cast in Season 1, the emotional core of the story could have hit a little harder. There is stuff you could do to make it better with the right expansion in mind. the writers of this film did not have the right expansion in mind. In fact, when it comes to Sandy's relationship with the Bikini Bottomite specifically, they actually found a way to make the idea of her caring about them and vice versa somehow less believable than it was in the show. I mean, sure, there's the opening number where everyone acts like they're the best of friends, including characters like Squidward and Plankton who are so over-the-top chipper it's kinda creepy, but aside from that, Sandy doesn't spend any time with the cast to show the type of bond they've got for the rest of the film, and there's a very obvious reason why. She's too busy trying to save them. The town gets scooped up literally 4 minutes in. There's practically no wait between the opening number and the inciting incident. So for a majority of the runtime, Sandy can't interact with anyone from Bikini Bottom other than SpongeBob. She's physically incapable of forming a connection with them on screen, so all we can go off to understand how she feels about the city and its residents is that opening number, but all she says in that song is that she's a marine biologist, so Bikini Bottom is the place for her. She never mentions who she cares about, or why she cares about them, or what the place means to her. We're just thrown into the situation of her and SpongeBob trying to get it back, and then during the climax, she concludes they're like a second family. It's so unnatural, and unlike Texas, where there's at least that big gesture at the end, there's nothing to show the cast actually cares about Sandy in this film. In fact, when they find out Wanda Sykes somehow used Sandy's research to do what she does in the film, even though it's explicitly stated Sandy didn't know, they immediately jump to acting as if she betrayed them or something. Like, huh? This is supposed to be her second family? Then why are they being such assholes to her? Especially when Sandy's been busting her ass the whole movie trying to save them while we've been sitting in the dark on what makes them worth it in the first place. Shouldn't you be endearing us to them right now? Helping us get why she'd go to the trouble of saving them in the first place? It's not like we already know who they are. Damn it. Fuck it. That's what they did, isn't it? The writers saw this as just another part of the show and thought they didn't have to put in the work of reestablishing shit, right? That's what's going on here? Jesus Christ, that's so lazy. But Braxton, what's wrong with that? It's a movie based on a TV show. Shouldn't the viewers come in already knowing the show? No, that's not how movies work. They're supposed to be isolated experiences detached from whatever they're based on. That's why every other SpongeBob movie fleshes out the world and characters before getting to the main plot. So first-time viewers who haven't watched anything else don't get confused. Most media franchises aren't the MCU. You shouldn't have to catch up on the timeline to get why what's happening matters. Although honestly, in this case, I'm not sure what there is to catch up on. SpongeBob is an episodic comedy built off the relationships of its characters. If you can't do the same on your own without the help of something else, then what you've built isn't fucking stable. The thing's gonna collapse in on itself, and it does. As a result of them leaning on the show so heavily for basic information, they don't ever properly introduce Squidward or Mr. Krabs or Patrick, so none of them mean anything to us, and that's a big problem, seeing as them and SpongeBob are supposed to be the main representatives of Bikini Bottom being Sandy's second family. I know they were just picked to fill that role because they were the main five in the last two movies, so you gotta keep it up for brand consistency, but still, if these four are that important, you shouldn't be shoving 75% of them off to the side for the whole movie. Where's the logic? What is it that makes these guys so close to her she thinks of them as family? Maybe it could have been believable if, say, they all went on an adventure together that demonstrated their bonds and what Sandy likes about Bikini Bottom as a whole. Just a thought. But then again, this is the crew that gave us the worst version of SpongeBob and Sandy ever, so expecting them to juggle 3 more beloved characters would probably be a recipe for disaster. I mean, we already got a taste of how they were written during the climax, and that was horrible, so who knows? Maybe this film being too lazy to establish the characters Sandy's supposed to care about, and botching the moral an 11-minute episode did better, was secretly a blessing in disguise, stopping us from seeing just how badly they could fuck up everyone else. That's a positive way to look at it, right? Like, okay, the emotional core of the film is empty, and Sandy never really gets a reason to care about Bikini Bottom, and frankly, the whole two families theme is sort of random, seeing as Sandy's never conflicted about whether she belongs more to one home or the other, implying it went through a ton of rewrites that left ideas hanging there without proper resolution. But hey, it could have been slightly worse. That's a comforting thought, isn't it? look, just be glad it's not quite as insulting to everything SpongeBob as it could have been. It's not as bad as the comedy. Oh, and speaking of, Part 3. Alright, so one of the first things I noticed when I started watching this film was that compared to earlier SpongeBob media, its comedy seemed to be going for a younger audience than the IP normally would. And I know that sounds weird to say about SpongeBob, something that's already made with being accessible for kids in mind, but like I said before, kids weren't the only ones who used to enjoy it. Everyone did. Golden Era SpongeBob was something you could laugh at whether you were 7, 17, or 47. And the main reason for why was that while the humor in SpongeBob was really smart in how it was set up, the jokes themselves were so well told and simple anyone could get them. That was the charm. Like, here, let's deconstruct a classic episode from Season 3 to show what I mean. Idiot Box. The whole concept of this story is that SpongeBob and Patrick use their imagination to have fun playing in an empty box, and Squidward's got no idea how, so he tries to figure it out. Now, this is a very simple premise on its surface. Some might even say it's basic. But what's actually ingenious about it is that it's fully reliant on character traits to guide its comedy. SpongeBob and Patrick are naturally childish and whimsical, so they can use their imagination easily. Meanwhile, Squidward is naturally cynical and boring, so he can't do the same, and that annoys him. He's jealous that they can have fun with practically nothing when he can't. But at the same time as being cynical and boring, Squidward's also prideful and stubborn, so he can't allow himself to just admit he lacks imagination either. That'd be saying SpongeBob and Patrick can do something better than him, and to Squidward, that's impossible. So therefore, if he doesn't lack imagination, and those two are having fun, they've gotta be messing with him on purpose or hiding how it works. Bam! Comedy! Squidward can't get he's a boring guy with no imagination, so he ironically uses his imagination to come up with dumb excuses for why he can't, only to find he's wrong every time. It's comedy that comes from a smart setup, seeing as the premise was built to play off specific character traits in a way that comments on their differences, but the comedy itself is also easy to understand since the information needed to get the jokes are told through that premise. It's smart humor that's made to be understood by everyone. And if you don't get it, you can just laugh at the absurdity of how, through their imagination, SpongeBob and Patrick can simulate realistic sounds without explanation, slowly driving Squidward crazy. I tell you, this shit is layered in how well it works, regardless of how deeply you understand it, and that's why people of all ages were able to love it. Older people laughed at how clever it was, younger people laughed at how absurdly creative it was. And if you look at almost any other episode in the first 3 seasons or film, you'll see they do this character-driven, scenario-based comedy all the time. It was basically the standard for them to be brilliant and universal. So with all of that in mind, going back to what I said before, how this new movie's comedy aims at a younger crowd than the series used to go for, that actually wasn't just an observation, it was an insult. Because to imply that SpongeBob has a cutoff age for when you can find it funny is to say the writing has gotten worse. And in the case of this film, oh, you better believe it has. In fact, I'd say this film has some of the worst comedic writing I've ever seen, and that's in general. Compared to early SpongeBob, this is like looking at a how-to guide on what not to do. I don't think you could make something less comparable to SpongeBob in how it approaches comedy. And I don't just mean that in the sense that it's unfunny, I mean everything about the way this film does humor is in direct opposition to how early SpongeBob would have done it. There aren't any jokes based on how the characters interact with each other, or react to situations, or deal with things that expose their personal flaws, or, well, anything that requires some type of setup to function. No, every joke in this film is something you can do with no setup at all, meaning they're either references, which don't take any effort to make, visual gags, which mostly consist of SpongeBob annoyingly shape-shifting, funny faces, which are about the lowest form of comedy when used in excess, as this film does, one-liners, which are almost always just shitty puns about what's currently happening, or finally, worst of all, the good old character whose entire personality is based off one singular trait does something that's related to their trait, which, aside from lacking any setup like the others, is personally the one I hate the most, since they perfectly demonstrate why these are the only kind of jokes we get from this movie. Because not a single character has enough depth to do anything else.
Remember, proper setup is only half the battle of doing SpongeBob's humor. The other half is having characters with enough interesting traits to build setups for jokes around. And this film doesn't have any good characters to work with. They're all too basic. Like, for example, take the Sandy movie's villain Wanda Sykes, or as she goes by in the film, Tsunami. Her whole thing is that she used to cuddle with sea creatures but got frustrated when they died, so now she wants to make breathing ones to clone and sell to other people. For some reason, I don't know. Her motivations weren't meant to be sensical, they were meant to be weird. Since that's what Tsunami's main defining trait is. Weirdness. Her motivation is weird, her hair is weird, her dog is weird, she's weird. That's what her identity boils down to at the end of the day. And you know why that's a problem? Because that's what her identity boils down to at the end of the day. She doesn't have any unique qualities or dynamics or mannerisms or flaws. She's just a generically weird, evil businesswoman, and so with nowhere else to take her comedically, not having anything to build off but the idea of weird, all they can do with her to try and be funny is keep pushing that concept further and further. So it's not just that Tsunami's got a weird dream and weird fashion sense, she's also got a giant mutant fish, and she's a cyborg, and in flashback sequences she's a kid but she has her adult face for some reason and it's really badly chroma keyed, and she gets eaten by the fish but somehow takes it over. Why? Because weird, because goofy, because one note, so the only way to keep the joke going was by getting more extreme. And that's how every new face in the Sandy movie is. They aren't written to be characters, they're written to be gags. Very specific gags. And so that's all they ever do. Tsunami's henchmen are dumb, so they say dumb things and mug the camera any chance they get. Sandy's family is full of wacky Southerners, so they do wacky Southern things. Sandy's inexplicable robot horse is goofy, so he makes the goofy faces. They aren't meant to bounce off each other or form connections, they're just supposed to keep feeding off their single defining traits for comedy until the end of time. That's what I meant when I said the cast are too basic to do SpongeBob's early humor. That wasn't just me being a dick, they literally aren't capable of it. That's how contradictory to SpongeBob's comedy this film's humor truly is. It's almost a joke in and of itself. Like, it wasn't enough to have lazy, poorly timed, underwhelming jokes that lack any of the precision, wit, or memorability early SpongeBob had. No, it had to be so fucking bad, it couldn't even do early SpongeBob's comedy in a theoretical sense. That's some next level failure right there. It'd almost be funny if it weren't so pathetic. Oh, what the hell, I'll laugh anyway. Okay, but laughing to numb the pain aside, it really is painful talking about this movie's jokes, knowing how fantastic this franchise used to be. I mean, early SpongeBob was smart, creative, funny, memorable, unpredictable, distinct. It built its humor on fun concepts that drew out the characters' personalities. It used jokes to comment on the nature of people and how we think. It had depth, variety, and identity, and most importantly of all, it made sure it worked on multiple levels so anyone could enjoy it. It was the type of show you came to appreciate more as you grew up and found everything you missed as a kid. All the little punchlines, deeper meanings, qualities, and characters you didn't understand back then but find way too relatable now. It may have been a show on a kid's network, but it wasn't made solely for kids. It was made for people who wanted to laugh, and man, I did. I hadn't watched SpongeBob in forever before making this video, but as soon as I started it up, I fell in love with it all over again. It was the first thing to make me genuinely burst out laughing in forever. And it happened multiple times per episode. I couldn't help it. And keep in mind, I've seen this show several times over the years. Half of the episodes are pretty much soldered into my brain word for word, bar for bar. So those punchlines still landing for me despite already knowing them says way more about its quality than I ever could. Comedically, there really was almost nothing like it. And that's something I could never say about the Sandy Cheeks movie. Because while it might put up a front of being wacky and out there with its zany characters and cyborgs and mutant fish and whatever and OMG she's so crazy, love her, the humor reveals everything this film is at its core. Derivative, boring, lazy, condescending, annoying, dumb, and worst of all, forgettable. What more can I say? Part 4. It's over. As in, the video.
This is the conclusion. The first time I watched this movie, I didn't really get why I felt the way I did about it. I mean, so many bad SpongeBob-related things have come out over the years. Episodes, specials, seasons, a different movie with a higher budget. It's a shit pile that's been growing bigger and bigger with no signs of stopping for decades on end at this point, and up till now, I've been able to just look at them, shrug, acknowledge they exist, and move on with my day. They didn't personally get to me, but the Sandy movie struck a nerve in me, something primal. Like, the moment I started watching, I knew it was different from everything that came before. Its content pinched my brain in a way that I couldn't quite describe at the time, but knew was wrong and had to be put into words. I had to figure out the answer to that simple question of, why? Why does this film, the fucking Saving Bikini Bottom Sandy Cheeks movie, make me so frustrated, so angry? Why did I decide this was the final straw? You know, early SpongeBob, it's a funny, timeless, amazing show with memorable characters and great writing that I've loved since I was a kid, but that era's been gone for such a long time, and it's hit so many lows already, so why start complaining now? Why single this film out as the death nail for SpongeBob's integrity? And well, I know this is gonna sound cliched and snobbish and possibly pretentious, but to put it as bluntly as I can, this just isn't SpongeBob. Not even a little bit. If anything, it's the antithesis to everything SpongeBob ever was. And I don't just mean that because it's unfunny and sloppy and basic, but because at its very foundation, it's missing the one thing every other SpongeBob project has had: the courage to form its own identity. I'm not just put off by how bad the Sandy movie is, I'm put off by how it doesn't try to do anything. Like, say what you will about the newer seasons, they try to do something. The spin-off series try to do something. Sponge on the Run try to do something. Even during its absolute worst moments as a brand and series, SpongeBob has always strived to do something. It hasn't always worked. Honestly, at this point, it's kind of failed more often than not, but when I look back at all the bad and good that's come from this property over the years, one thing it all has in common is that it was made by people who had their own visions. There was ambition and flavor and a want to try something new that they'd never done before. But all this ever does is rehash ideas and half-ass everything else. Its characters are all flanderized shells or one-note gags with no depth to speak of. Its plot and messages are recycled from other better stories by the same property and done objectively worse. Its basic lowest common denominator humor is made to be pumped out quick and easy and forgotten just as quickly. And it stretches out every worthless, meandering scene just to reach the 80-minute mark, since it's barely got enough substance to last more than 20. There isn't a single thing about this film besides the animation that feels like it came from a place of care or passion or anything other than straight apathy. To think this was written by Kaz, a veteran talent from season 3 who's now one of the main series writers and a major driving force behind both spin-offs, is so genuinely strange if true, since this doesn't feel like a series veteran's work at all. It felt like the work of someone who'd never done anything SpongeBob before and only cared enough to look up episode summaries to steal ideas from. Shit, if there was an explicit word from the staff saying they wanted to do this project, I would have been convinced everyone on board was forced into it, and could you blame me? The atmosphere of this film is as cold and lifeless as the health inspector. It's depressing how dead it seems, and I've got a feeling this movie isn't gonna bounce back up. There ain't no soul in that body to keep it chugging. It's just gonna keep sitting there, laying in its own filth, content with the state it's in, until Mr. Krabs and SpongeBob finally bury it. You missed a spot, by the way. There you go, that's better. And nothing of value was lost. But I know that's not how it works. This film will always exist, regardless of how much I want to pretend it doesn't. And while I'm not gonna go on some unhinged rant saying this desecrated Steven Hillenburg's memory or anything, and neither should you, the people who made this are just doing their jobs, if I'm ever asked by anyone when I personally think SpongeBob died, it'll be here. Not literally, of course. The series will probably keep running till the end of time, and this moment won't invalidate any good things that come out afterwards. That would be dumb, but in the grand scheme of things, it'll never be the same. This is the SpongeBob SquarePants event horizon, and there's no going back. But if I can leave you with something positive having said that, don't remember this franchise for what killed it. Remember it for what kept it alive. Appreciate all the work that went into those good years. Hell, appreciate what went into the bad. Because if there's one thing this film does right, it makes you realize just how good we never knew we had it. I've been Just Stop, you've been fired, your severance package is in the mail, and thanks for watching.